Throughout history, people have taken on all kinds of work to survive, but some jobs were downright disturbing. Long before the world had plumbing, hospitals, or even basic entertainment, civilizations still had to function, and that meant someone had to handle the dirty work. As time passed and cultures evolved, so did the jobs that kept society running. But if we look back far enough, especially to places like ancient Egypt, we find a world where daily life looked nothing like ours. Still, even in their golden age of pyramids and pharaohs, survival came with a price, and that price often meant doing things most of us today couldn't even stomach. So, what did survival really look like in ancient Egypt? What tasks were considered important enough that someone, usually someone poor or desperate, had to do them? These weren't glamorous positions or heroic roles. These were the gritty, revolting, and thankless jobs that kept the gears of ancient Egyptian society turning. Here are 12 truly disgusting jobs from ancient Egypt that remind us just how far we've come and how much people have endured to keep their world from falling apart. Some of the most revolting jobs in ancient Egypt involved blood, waste, or death, but others were just as disturbing in quieter, more personal ways. Not every role demanded strength or fearlessness. Some required silent obedience, patience, and a tolerance for deep humiliation. That brings us to one such job that blended beauty with servitude in the most twisted way. 12th ornitresses. Long before hair salons and stylists became professions of choice, there were ornitresses, women whose entire existence revolved around making their masters look perfect. But they weren't employees, they were enslaved. In ancient Roman-influenced Egypt, beauty was a symbol of status, and these women were responsible for helping wealthy elites maintain that image every single day. Styling back then wasn't as simple as reaching for a bottle of dye or curling iron. Ornitresses had to experiment and invent. They created hair products from disgusting materials, crushed insects, squid ink, bile, and even rotting leeches to darken hair. To lighten it, they'd smear pigeon droppings and ash onto their master's scalp. Nothing was off limits if it achieved the right look. If that wasn't dehumanizing enough, things got worse when a patch of hair was missing. Ornitresses were expected to shave their own heads so their master could wear their hair as a wig. Their bodies were used as tools, their talents unrecognized, and their labor seen as nothing more than property. And while their work focused on appearance, what went on behind the scenes was far from glamorous. Every day brought new demands, strange ingredients, and humiliating sacrifices. But that wasn't the only way enslaved people in ancient Egypt were reduced to tools for someone else's comfort. In some cases, their entire purpose wasn't to serve, clean, or cook. It was simply to suffer. 11. Human fly traps. Imagine being so powerful that you never had to swat a single fly, not because there weren't any, but because someone else was suffering in your place. That was the daily reality under the rule of King Pepi II, a pharaoh who hated being bothered by insects. Instead of dealing with flies like everyone else, he had a solution that was as disturbing as it was effortless. He ordered his slaves to be covered in honey from head to toe, not for healing or preservation, but to lure flies away from him. Their sticky skin became bait. Their bodies, left to stand or sit nearby, attracted every buzzing insect that would have otherwise landed on the king. Day after day, they were turned into living traps, stuck in place for hours to make his surroundings more pleasant. No concern for their comfort, no recognition of the pain that came with bites, heat, and humiliation. Just honey, heat, and silence. Their suffering became routine, something expected, something invisible, and all of it to keep one man's skin from being touched by a single fly. A life spent standing still, swarmed to protect someone else's comfort. But But not every form of service in ancient Egypt was so passive. Some required not just endurance, but courage. Because in certain temples, what waited in the water wasn't an insect or a master. It was a god with teeth. 10. Crocodile caretaker. Most people would run at the sight of a crocodile. In ancient Egypt, some walked toward it, carrying food, dressed in ceremonial robes, whispering prayers. Because this wasn't just an animal, it was living divinity. The Egyptians worshipped Sobek, the crocodile-headed god of strength, fertility, and the life-giving Nile. And in many temples, Sobek wasn't just honored with statues. He was given a physical form, real crocodiles, alive and watching. The job of caring for them fell to a temple worker, a crocodile caretaker. Their task was terrifying and exact. Raise the crocodile from birth, feed it raw meat, sometimes several times a day, bathe it in sacred water, rub its skin with oils, and in certain rituals, dress it in gold jewelry or wrap it in fine linen. But none of this was done for beauty. It was survival. If the crocodile attacked, it wasn't seen as an accident. It was divine judgment. One bite meant the god was angry, and the cost could be a priest's life. But death didn't end the work. It only changed it. When the crocodile passed, the same caretaker who raised it had to prepare its body for eternity. That meant draining blood, removing organs, soaking the body in oils, wrapping it in resin-soaked linen, and sealing amulets inside. It was done with care, but it wasn't done once. Some temples bred hundreds of crocodiles, not for worship, but for sale. Pilgrims would come from faraway cities to buy a mummified crocodile as a holy offering. In one site alone, the Kam Ombo Temple, archaeologists uncovered a pit filled with over 10,000 crocodile mummies. Some were tiny, barely born. Others were massive. All were treated the same, dried, wrapped, and stacked like sacred merchandise. Now imagine being the man who raised them, fed them, named them, only to watch them die again and again. The one who lived beside them, slept near the pond, and had to drag back any that escaped. There were no breaks, no protection, just a silent rule. One mistake could mean being torn apart by the very God you served. So, ask yourself, could you spend your life loving something that might tear you open in a heartbeat? And worse, could you still call it holy as you wrapped its body in linen? But not all gods had teeth. Some were buried beneath the very ground Egyptians walked on. Sacred places, tombs, and temples weren't just built, they were preserved. And to maintain them, someone had to fight against the one enemy that never slept, the desert. 9. Sand collectors. It may sound simple, picking up sand, moving it, and clearing it away. But in ancient Egypt, where the line between life and death was drawn in the dust, this was more than a cleaning task. Entire teams of workers were assigned to guard the entrances of tombs, palaces, and ceremonial paths, armed not with weapons, but with baskets and shovels. Every day, winds from the Sahara pushed waves of sand over everything in sight. It buried steps, choked doorways, and covered statues that were meant to be seen by the gods. And someone had to undo all of it by hand. These men worked under the brutal sun, their skin cracked and burned, pulling sand out by the handful, sometimes digging waist deep to reveal what had just been visible the day before. And it wasn't just endless labor, it was dangerous. Underneath the sand were scorpions, sharp stones, and even collapsed sections of old ruins. A misstep could snap a leg or leave a man trapped, but there were no safety nets. If the wind undid your work, you started again. If the path disappeared, you cleared it. Because to the Egyptians, the tombs had to stay open. The gods had to see. And someone, every single day, had to dig through a moving grave to make that happen. But sand wasn't the only thing ancient workers had to wade through. Sometimes, what they were forced to clean up came from people themselves, a mess left not by nature, but by gluttony. 8. Vomit collector. Few jobs in ancient history are as stomach-turning as this one. As the Roman influence spread into Egypt and surrounding regions, so did certain habits, especially among the elite. One of the most disturbing? Eating until they couldn't anymore, and then eating again. And to make that possible, they vomited on purpose. It wasn't private or discreet. Royals and wealthy nobles would overindulge at long feasts, then empty their stomachs to make room for more food. They didn't even bother to leave the dining area. That's where the vomit collector came in. These workers were expected to be present during meals, standing by with special bowls to catch the vomit when the time came. No one flinched. It was normal. Vomiting was just part of the feast. In larger banquets where guests filled every seat, there weren't always enough bowls to go around. When that happened, people vomited onto the floor. And once again, the collector stepped in, cleaning the floor, wiping up the mess, and dealing with whatever had landed in their bowl. If they were lucky, they avoided getting splashed. Most weren't. It wasn't just disgusting, it was dehumanizing. They were there not to serve food, but to clean up the ugly consequences of excess, quietly, quickly, and without a word. And if cleaning up vomit wasn't bad enough, imagine what came after the feast was over. 7. Waste collector. The identical palaces that hosted endless meals also held dozens of chambers, latrines, and drainage pits. But plumbing, as we know it today, didn't exist. Waste didn't disappear. It gathered. It soaked into the walls. It settled into corners and flowed into dark underground spaces. And of course, someone had to go down there. The next job on this list didn't come with any title of honor. There were no rituals, no sacred oils, no blessings from the gods. Just rot, fumes, and a tunnel barely wide enough to crawl through. These workers didn't wear fine linen. They wore rags. Their skin was always marked with cuts, their lungs with filth, their eyes stung from gases rising from places no one else dared to look. This wasn't ceremonial. It was survival. The filth had to be removed, or it would flood back into the homes of the powerful. So, they crawled, they scraped, they carried bucket after bucket out of the dark, just so the world above could keep pretending it was clean. Because in ancient Egypt, luxury was always built on someone else's misery. And some had to live in it, every single day. Not just surrounded by filth, but crawling with it. Because while some worked under the weight of waste and rot, others had to deal with what clung to the skin of the living. In a time without proper hygiene, pest control, or even the concept of sanitation as we know it, lice and parasites weren't rare. They were expected, and someone had to handle them directly. 6. Lice removers. In ancient Egypt, cleanliness was highly valued, especially among the elite, but soap didn't exist the way it does now. Hot water was a luxury, and lice were everywhere. Nobles shaved their heads to prevent infestation, but even that wasn't enough. So, they assigned someone else to fix the problem. The lice remover. It was exactly what it sounds like. These young servants were often ordered to sit behind their masters for hours, combing through what little hair remained, inspecting the scalp, and removing lice by hand, sometimes with crude combs, sometimes with nails, one by one, for hours, day after day. The infestation never honestly stopped. It just paused. The job demanded silence, precision, and complete invisibility. If a single louse slipped past, it was the servant's fault. Punishments followed, and yet the task never ended. Behind the ears, along the neck, even on the eyebrows, every part of the body had to be inspected. The closer they got, the more likely they were to catch it themselves. But that didn't matter. What mattered was making sure the nobles never saw a bug on their body. And if they did, you'd better pray it wasn't moving, Because in ancient Egypt, even the smallest failure could mean humiliation, punishment, or worse. But not every uncomfortable job was about cleaning, crawling, or combing. Some were about performance. Public emotion turned into duty, and few jobs were as bizarre as this next one. 5. Professional mourners. Death was sacred in Egypt. The passing of a loved one demanded ceremony, sound, and sorrow. But what happened when there weren't enough tears? You hired them. Their job was to cry louder than grief itself, to convince the gods, the spirits, and the neighbors that the person being buried mattered. Some wore matching clothes. Others painted their faces or tore their garments on cue. It wasn't emotion. It was a theater, and they were expected to perform until their voices cracked. Because in death, silence was never an option. But even in life, noise could be a problem, especially the kind no one wanted to talk about. The elites of ancient Egypt lived in a world built on order, appearance, and pride. Everything had to be perfect: the clothes, the posture, the language. But bodies aren't perfect, and sometimes they made unwanted sounds. That's where the next job comes in. 4. Flatulent servants. Yes, this was real. In specific noble households, where appearances meant everything, passing gas was seen as deeply shameful, even offensive to the gods. But holding it in during long banquets or ceremonies wasn't always an option. So instead of pretending it didn't happen, some households took a different approach. They assigned someone to handle it. Flatulent servants were positioned near their master and trained to either cough, shift, or make noise at just the right moment to cover the sound. In other cases, they were expected to absorb the embarrassment, sometimes even claiming responsibility if someone noticed. Their entire purpose was to ensure that dignity remained intact, even when nature had other plans. They weren't entertainers. They were human shields for awkwardness. Imagine your whole job being timed to someone else's gas, staying silent when needed, loud when ordered, and invisible at all times. Because in ancient Egypt, even a fart could cost you your reputation. But the next one is even more shocking. 3. Tomb centers. Believe it or not, ancient Egyptians were obsessed with how the dead smelled. Since decay was seen as a disruption to the soul's journey, wealthy families hired specialists known as tomb centers, people whose entire job was to make a tomb smell divine. These weren't your average incense vendors. They were olfactory artists. Tomb centers worked closely with embalmers and priests to fill burial chambers with specific fragrances like frankincense, myrrh, cedarwood, and lotus essence. Why? Because it was believed that sweet smells guided the soul to the afterlife, while foul odors could anchor it to earth. Some even layered perfumes between the mummy wrappings to trick the senses into thinking the body was still alive. And these scent artisans didn't come cheap. The rarer the ingredients, the higher the cost, and the more heavenly the tomb's atmosphere. Some historians say they carried secret blends passed down through generations, guarded like magical recipes. But while some Egyptians specialized in guiding the dead to the afterlife with fragrance, others had a far more intimate relationship with the gods. 2. Sacred prostitutes. Yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. In certain temple cults, especially those devoted to fertility gods and goddesses like Hathor or Amun, there were individuals, often women, but sometimes men, whose role was to engage in ritual sex as an offering to the divine. These so-called sacred prostitutes weren't shamed or hidden. In fact, their duties were considered holy. They weren't just engaging in intimacy for pleasure. They were seen as earthly vessels through which mortals could connect to the gods. Some ceremonies involved marriage to a deity, where a priestess symbolically became the god's bride and performed rituals meant to ensure fertility for the land, the people, or even the pharaoh himself. It was a job cloaked in gold and incense, But make no mistake, the expectations were weighty. You weren't just satisfying human desires, you were expected to please the gods. Because in ancient Egypt, even love, just like death, had its own hired professionals. But if you thought sacred intimacy was as wild as it gets, think again. Because the oddest, most jaw-dropping job in all of ancient Egypt wasn't about worshiping the gods, burying the dead, or even seducing deities. It was something far more disturbing. 1. Professional mummy destroyers. Yes, there were people whose entire job was to break into tombs and smash mummies, not for theft, but by royal command. During specific turbulent periods, especially when political power shifted or rival dynasties took over, pharaohs and high priests would order the ritual destruction of their enemies' tombs. The goal was to erase their names from history and ensure they'd never reach the afterlife. And for that, they needed people who weren't just fearless, but cold-blooded. These hired tomb smashers would storm into sacred burial chambers, deface hieroglyphs, shatter canopic jars, and yes, smash mummies into dust. It wasn't looting. It was sanctioned historical murder, erasing someone's soul by destroying their earthly remains. It's a job that flies in the face of everything Egyptians held sacred. And yet, for the right price, there were always hands willing to do the unthinkable. So, the next time you're groaning about emails or dreading your Monday meeting, remember this. At least you're not grinding up mummy dust, massaging crocodiles, or being married off as part of a temple's spiritual HR program. We may have hustle culture today, but ancient Egypt had hustle for the afterlife, for love, and even for sand. And compared to that, our weird job complaints don't stand a chance. So what do you think about this video? Please share with us in the comments section below. We would love to read them. Also, if you liked this video, share it with your friends and subscribe to our channel for more interesting content.